Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's version of DevOps Derek. This week I have Jack Tracey with me. Hey, Jack, how are you going today?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, Derek. Thanks for having me. It's nice to do something different on a Monday evening for once instead of going and watch Netflix. So yeah, thanks for having me along.
Hey, wait a minute. Netflix doesn't sound like such a bad idea, to be honest, on a Monday. I'll likely be doing that after tonight's stream.
I think we all
Um,
will. It's all about limiting it, though, right? Otherwise, you run out of content very quickly in a week.
I've never found that I've run out of content with Netflix. But anyway, enough about Netflix. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Cool. So yeah, I'm Jack Tracey. I am 27, so quite young for the industry. I've been at Microsoft now for 7 months. So I started during April, so just as lockdown started, which was an interesting experience. I'm referred to as the Jack bot in my team because I've never met any of my team physically, so I could just be a team spot. But yeah, so I've been in the Microsoft Azure space for probably 7 years, so since the early days of ASM Classic. But yeah, a bit of history from me. I was a former Azure MVP. Obviously, joining the mothership, you can't have that title anymore. So
Oh,
I think I was the shortest ever MVP because I was awarded in March 2020 and I started at
right.
Microsoft April 2020. So a lot of hard work and a lot of effort. And you'll probably see the award still up here because,
I can just about see it. Yep.
it's up there. I like to put it on showcase. It's a great thing to be awarded, and a lot of time and a lot of effort running user groups and stuff like that. But yeah, been that, and my route into the cloud really is all from a networking perspective. So I've always been a networking engineer. So talk IPs, routes, BGP, and all that stuff to me. Happy days. So yeah, I'm not your typical developer or sort of VMware or SAN guy. I am very much a network focused guy. So I have to understand the networking before I understand anything else.
Right. That's cool. That's cool. So I'll talk to you. Obviously, we're talking today about Azure governance, but so we can talk about express routes. Maybe get you back. Actually, maybe we can talk about different ways to connect to Azure from on premise. Actually,
I would be more
um,
than happy to come and talk about Azure networking. I can talk for a good while about that. Virtual WAN, Express Route, VPN gateways. Yeah, we've got all sorts there. And a really interesting space, with Orbital. Did you see Orbital get announced at Ignite?
I didn't know. Unfortunately, I won't lie. Ignite was actually during my birthday, so I'm still catching up a little bit. As much as I love Microsoft and I love Ignite, there's certain things you don't do on your birthday.
Yeah.
I actually need to check it. Actually, tell us a little bit about it.
So Orbital is about controlling satellites in space from Azure. So ground stations and effectively connecting Azure to space is a good way of summarizing it. So very,
Nice.
very cool. Great marketing thing, like great to have out there in terms of Azure connection to space. Who doesn't want to say that?
It's great because obviously I saw recently where obviously up in I think it was Orkneys or Shetland they built the data center out of the sea. That I have to say that I think is I come from an ops background, so we probably have quite a few over. I'm not quite as up to networking. Like yeah, I can do networking. It's not my favorite thing in the world, but I thought that was really cool when Microsoft built a data center out of the sea. Saying that I don't fancy pulling the cables down, but apart from that, I thought that was such a cool thing, and it
I
kind of
think the
shows you
best
though. Sorry,
So I thought the best thing from that whole Project Natick was obviously it's version 2. So we had version 1 that happened in California, I think it was, or
yeah,
Seattle. I can't really remember. But version 2, obviously, of Orkney. The best job, jet washing it. That was so satisfying from an OCD perspective. That
yeah,
that is the job I wanted out of that.
it looked fun. The thing I was interested about was the hardware failure was almost next to nothing.
Eight
Um,
times less than on prem. It's
yeah,
insane.
I remember I read they think it's because of people. It's always the bit in between the chair and the keyboard. I find is generally the problem. But yeah, I mean that's I thought that was really cool. 8 times, but that's probably people because people aren't in, dropping flakes of their skin and creating dust and all sorts of problems.
Or dropping a
Anyway,
cage nut as we all do, right?
oh, and your fingers, like it's it's funny, right? I think I first got into Azure 2013, 2014, but really started using it in 2014 because what happened was I used to live in London. I used to work in East End of London for a technical agency. Um, and we had our own data centers. And then I remember looking at Azure at the time, and I was like, wait a minute, right, it's time to look into cloud. We had all this on prem. We had 3 data centers, we had loads of kit, and it was quite hard to get in. So I actually moved out then to Melbourne. And what happened was Azure launched in Australia, right? So I was like, so I somehow got invited. I had only been there 6 weeks or 7 weeks, something like that. I managed to get an invite to Microsoft in Sydney, and I was at the launch event, right? So I'm sitting in the room with Scott Guthrie, and all these like really big tech directors from like PwC, Deloitte, etc. And I'm just like, I'm just new. I've moved over as director of technical services. I'm sitting in this, and I was like, I'm sitting in Microsoft, right? And I was just like, and everybody else was so important, and I was just like, yeah, I'm just a dude, like a laptop, just want to know about Azure. And then after that, I've been using it because what happened was the cost of hosting in Australia is just, it's like
Really?
you know, it's something because obviously with data centers, traditional data centers, you pay per square foot, and it was the way it worked out was it was something like 400 or 500% more to host a server, and that's before you put in any, that's just the rent. That's before you put a bit of kit in. So at that point, I just pushed on the Azure, and then from there, it was just like, yeah, cool. We've got a couple of servers in the office. The rest is in Azure, and then we kind of just be done with it. Um,
Nice.
but yeah, it was cool. It was cool. It was interesting. It was fun. It was definitely fun meeting Scott Guthrie. I did kind of geek out a little bit. I saw he had Satya Nadella on. I think it was Link then. Maybe just early days in Skype for Business. But I remember looking up, and he was on. He wasn't online. But at the same time, I thought that was cool. But yeah. So today you're here to talk about Azure Governance. So what is Azure Governance?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point, and you've probably heard it referred to as landing zones. That's quite a common way that people will refer to governance in Azure. But governance in Azure is a few things, right? So first of all, it's permissions, right? So role-based access control, RBAC as we all call it, or IAM if you're from an AWS way, or look in the portal, it's referred to as that.
Yeah.
But who have you got permissions to do X operation? So create a VM or delete a network or change a NSG, those sort of things. So permissions, that's one element of it, and we'll definitely cover that in a lot more detail. You've then got posture management, so things like Azure policies you've probably heard. So that's fine. You've got permissions to go and create a storage account, but you can't create a storage account that has public access enabled. How are you going to control that? Now, from an Azure governance perspective, Azure policy is your tool on that element, right? So this is how we want things configured. Everything has to meet, and there's different effects. There's audit, so let it happen, but tell me about it. Deny, stop it from happening in the first place. And then we've got lots of different effects there that we can dive into a little bit later. And then you take it. That's sort of like the technical pieces, right? And obviously there's a lot of detail we dive into in those areas. But then you've got the more organizational and hierarchy based structures, so management groups and your subscription organization. That's a really big thing that is fairly new. I would say probably for the Azure architecture days that I've had at previous partners where I worked before I worked at Microsoft, I was only really talking about those for probably the last 2 years. Because the management groups is a fairly new feature anyway, sort of in the last 2 years. Subscriptions have always been like, how many do we have? Do we have one? Do I have 10,000? What's the deal? Do I use resource groups? Do I not? That whole mind-boggling process, and that's something that you absolutely need to design now. So I've done a lot of sessions in the past about manage subscriptions and management groups. Do I really need to design these as well as my application? Yes, you absolutely do. There is a security boundary there. There is scaling boundaries. There's all sorts of things, and we're definitely going to touch on that a lot more today. And then you've got, if you've got an EA customer, so an enterprise agreement customer, they've then got like their billing portals to arrange and organize. So departments, accounts, all that sort of stuff. So there's so many levels of governance within Azure, and there's so many different lenses you can put on it. I think ultimately it all comes down to least privilege access. So giving people permissions to do what they need to do, not full rights all the time. And also, making sure that those resources you're deploying within Azure are compliant as per your company standards. So, that's really where Azure Governance is. It's an ever-evolving space, and there's been some really nice announcements that we'll discuss a little bit later. But yeah, Azure Governance is a topic I'm very passionate about. I don't know if you saw, but Gregor and Richard announced the new festive calendar, didn't they, for next year?
They did, yeah. I think it was on Friday, maybe Saturday. but yeah,
I need to put in my session to go on that. But last year for the Advent calendar, I did one on Azure Governance,
right.
and I watched back on that about over the weekend, I think, and the amount that's changed or slightly changed since I spoke about that during December is scary. So we've now got a lot more features and a lot more changes and a lot more guidance really around what you should do and how you approach these things. So yeah, that's what we're here to talk about today. Probably fits into the cloud adoption framework quite nicely. So if you're aware of that, CAF is a topic we could talk about again on another subject. There's the whole big thing. This fits into the ready pillar of CAF. So once you've done all the theory and the logic and is the cloud the right thing for us? Now we need to build something, and now we need to start putting stuff in Azure. This is when governance becomes really important.
Awesome. So it's a people thing, but it's also a policy. You've got different types of products in there that will help you out as well. Obviously, you've got your permission. So, I mean, it's kind of like a mix of Azure Active Directory, policies, management groups, etc. So, but the key bit in the middle is the people, and obviously, without that, there is no Azure governance. And it's funny because one of the questions I was going to ask, don't you just give everybody global administrator access anyway?
Yeah, global admins, owners on all the subscriptions, go wild, right? Yeah, absolutely. No, is the short answer to that. And depending on your license types, and this is where there's always that blend, right? And it's really important to understand the scopes of Azure. So you've obviously got your Azure Active Directory tenant right at the top, and all of the cloud services that we offer, be that Dynamics or Microsoft 365, Azure, all feed up into that identity source. And that's really key to understand. But then from an Azure perspective, we really break down into, you've got your tenant, your Azure AD tenant, you've then got your management groups and whatever hierarchy you've created there. And then you step into your subscriptions, then resource groups, and then your resources. So you've got like 5 or 6 levels of scope there that you can apply different policies and permissions at. And you don't want to give somebody owner at the very top of your management group structure because they can do whatever they like and give
Yeah.
anybody else access. So yeah, least privilege access is absolutely something that is a recommendation. However, we do see it. People do give owner permissions out because it's easier. But once you tell somebody the difference between owner and contributor, that's quite an interesting get. They're like, oh, what? So they can deploy everything, but they can't add other admins. And like, yep. And they're like, I'm going to go and change all my permissions.
Yeah, it's that's actually the one that I tend to I tend to default to when I'm giving someone who's a fellow techie, because contributor can get you can do everything, but like you say, but there's lots and lots of ways for you to do it. Because like management groups is only something I've been aware about probably this year. Because obviously I've been doing a lot of Azure certification, and what it is Octopus. We have at Octopus we have, imagine several. We have an enterprise agreement, and then we have lots of different subscriptions. Like we have the cloud, like Octopus Cloud is run on AKS, for instance. So
Okay.
like that actually has its own. Like I don't have access to that. That all runs on like that all runs on the Kubernetes service. So I have no access to that. But what I do have access to is like a dev playground, and that's under a different one. And then I'm part of the Octopus advisory team. So we have our own one as well, because you can have that parent one, and then your management groups is like traditionally. I think how like obviously I've been doing some certifications. It tends to be explained in Microsoft Docs as like HR, finance, etc. And then like that you can separate those out, but you can also then have just subscriptions within certain groups as well, and then further you can then also go into the resource group side of things as well.
Yeah, so I think a really bad way of explaining management groups is, and anybody who's listening from Microsoft, I know you're going to shoot me for saying this, but think of it as Active Directory OUs, right? That is the best
Right.
way of explaining it. Grouping subscriptions into OUs, so you can apply central management and permissions and policy to them, and everything inherits down. And the key difference that I always say to my customers is you can't turn inheritance off. So it's not like NTFS permissions or GPOs where you can say deny inheritance. That doesn't exist in the Azure world. Everything inherits by default. If you want to overwrite it, you put a denial or an exception in place to exclude that scope. But yeah, that's as you say, they're really new, but also really powerful.
Nice. Yeah. No, I definitely, because it's funny. I tried to get access to the management group, but they wouldn't. As part of my learning, it's not some. That's the thing, though. Like, obviously, going through your certification, it's not something that you can just give yourself access to. Not without a lot of work, anyway. Or is it?
So as long as you've got right permissions on your Azure Active Directory, so generally if you're a GA on Azure Active Directory,
Yeah,
you should be able to create and manage management groups. But if somebody's already created them, so you have to enable management groups, and when you enable management groups, there's actually a root management group that's created
yeah,
above the tenant root group that you see. So you see tenant root group. There's actually one created above that that you don't actually get to see. You can only see through PowerShell and the APIs. But effectively, I don't know if you've been to Azure Active Directory, but if you go into properties, there's
yeah.
like an elevate and a yes and no sliding, like elevate to give access to all subscriptions, whatever. If you
Right,
set
right.
that to yes and click save, that actually grants you user access admin at that hidden root management group. So you can
Right.
see everything. And then obviously it's almost like a break glass thing, right? But you have to be GA to enable that and all those things. And obviously from a permissions perspective, we'd absolutely recommend that you put privileged identity management in place so that
Yeah,
you have to elevate yourself. You have to get approval to elevate to a privileged role and go through that. But obviously there's a license and a cost perspective to think about there. But that's absolutely nirvana state, if we call it that.
yeah.
Privileged identity management is absolutely the dream in that world.
Have to say, yeah, obviously, I've learnt a lot about that recently doing my exams, and it is something I have to say, just in time access. When I started looking at it, I was like, that is beautiful. That I was really taken back. I was just like, I come from like let's say ops, but quite security focused, and it was just like I looked at it and I was just like, this is literally the perfect and like it's the perfect way to do it because you normally have like different users. You would have, like, say, for instance, you would have like Derek, right? And then you would have admin dash Derek or some version of that. What I
Yeah.
like is you can use your normal account and then just activate it. And it is all logged as well. There's lots of
Yeah.
really nice stuff there.
And that's the benefit, right? The logging is so key of that. Like, it's not only, yes, you can elevate and perform the permission, but actually you could put in approval gates to say that your manager has to approve your access. You have to put in a justification, a
Yeah,
ticket number. Most people say put in there as well, as in, I'm doing this because of this ticket.
yeah,
And then that full audit trail. So, when you go, 6 months later and you've had like a breach or something, and they go, what happened on, the 22nd of April at 8 p.m.? You're like, oh, I wondered if what happened on that day. And you go looking in the logs
yeah.
and it's all there, and it's you've got that audit trail, which is so nice. But you get that the audit trail's there already, right? But it's that privilege access elevation that is the nice thing from PIM. You do need Azure Active Directory Premium P2 license in those, so
Yeah,
there is a bit of a barrier there for entry. But a lot of people forget that you only need it for your admins, right? You don't need it for every user. Now, obviously, there are other benefits for giving it for your entire workforce, which
yeah.
we won't cover tonight. But even if you just did it for your admins, say you had a company of 1,000 staff, it's what 50 are going to be IT related. You know,
Yeah,
that's a lot less than. And what's the cost of the breach? That's always what I say. How much is
could
a
be the end of
breach
the
going to
business.
cost you? Yeah,
It could be the end of the business. That's the thing. It hurts your business that much because ultimately that's the thing. Like nowadays is like 15 years ago, people didn't hear about that sort of stuff now, whereas now it's security is central to whatever we're doing. So it is,
absolutely.
and this is where Azure governance really does come in. So you're saying as well about policies. Obviously, I'm aware of policies, but what sort of stuff can you lock down, for instance, with policies?
So policy, you can lock down pretty much anything that's exposed. If you've looked at an ARM template before, you'll notice that there's properties and subsections and SKUs and different bits and pieces like that. Anything that is accessible via the APIs. Now, hands up, not everything is covered today. I would say there's probably like a 99.5% coverage of settings and properties.
Yeah,
And we'll get into how you can discover those hopefully a little bit later. But most things are covered, right? There's very rarely that I come across things today that I can't protect with policy. So some common things are the regions you're allowed to deploy resources into. So say you might only want things stored in the UK for data sovereignty purposes. You can create a policy right at that top level management group that's inherited down across your stack that says we can only deploy to UK South and UK West. And then from that level, we'll put it in deny effect. And if anybody tries to go against that, it'll stop them when they hit the create button. It'll go, sorry, you're not compliant with policy. You can't do that. You can also do things like allowed VM SKU sizes. So a bit of a cost focus. You might
yeah,
want people to go and go wild with A, B, D series, F series, but the N series, the M series, and the L series, that they're reserved for a special purpose. Like, they can rack up some serious costs pretty quickly.
yeah,
So you might want to lock them away from your average users and say, look, actually, these aren't allowed to be deployed by anybody. And that's an important thing to call out actually with policy. it's at the moment, I always say that at the moment because you don't know what's going to change in the future. But you can't link them to user group memberships. So you can't say this set of users can do, create VMs of N series or L series or M series. It's one rule for all. That's the thing to take away a policy. So if you apply a policy, it affects everybody, and you have to exclude it or remove the policy, do your stuff, and put it back in place. So there's also a new feature that's come out called exemptions, which we'll get onto later. But that's really, really cool.
I like the idea of it.
So yeah, so you can do anything basically with policy, anything that you can see in an ARM template. You can protect, say this value must, you're looking for this value must equals or not equals this.
Yeah. So you do like OS versions as well. Like for instance, you log into like server 2016, you're not allowed any other version of that Windows OS, for instance.
Yeah, you could go down, like a lot of my customers go down the route of we've created a golden image, right? Our secure baseline security image of our Windows server. So we've got that in a managed image or a shared image gallery inside of Azure. And actually we can create a policy that says the only place that you can get an image from for Windows VMs is this image version over here in the gallery. They can't even deploy stuff from the marketplace at that stage. So, you're controlling what people can do regardless of the permissions they've got.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Think of it as guardrails for like a bowling alley, right? You want to keep people on the straight and narrow. I always say it's guardrails. You're not trying to create the right and wrong, and you're not trying to create, you have to do it this way and you have to do it this way, because all you'll do at that stage is create shadow IT. People will just go around you. They'll get the credit card out. They're going to spin up a subscription somewhere else that isn't controlled by you and go and do what they like. And then it goes, why is your expenses bill 30 grand this month? And I'll be like, oh, well, I spun up all this stuff in Azure because I couldn't do it in our environment because it was blocked. So there's a fine balance, and that's why I say it's guardrails, right? Bowling, you always want to hit the pins, but you don't care how you get there.
Yeah, it's more. I think it's like you see. I think it's more about guiding people than enforcing. Obviously, you're sort of enforcing as well, but it's more about just making sure they're because that's the things like a developer, for instance, may come in and try to deploy something, to Europe or the US, and then obviously you have certain laws in place. So it's just about kind of just a framework, like you say, like a framework to work within. So that's cool.
It's something you tighten over time as well, right? So you may start off, and I always say to my customers, don't go in heavy first, right? Pick 5 or 10 policies that are the absolute no-no. So I would say like the key things are regions, right? Data sovereignty is a big thing. So easily got wrong. You go in the portal, you've got 50, 60 odd regions to choose from. It's hard to, it could be possible to select the wrong one. You select North Europe instead of North Central US. They both go in North, all that sort of stuff. So just stop people from being able to do it. Say UK South and UK West, it's an easy thing for them to fix. Another one I always say is tags, right? And tags is probably a key part of Azure Governance that I missed right at the beginning. So don't worry, I've covered it, people. I've not forgotten tags. They are absolutely critical to your environment to enable you to do that lateral querying. So regardless of your management group hierarchy and where things live, say you want to query across subscriptions for like cost data, tags is going to help you massively in that case. And, but what's the most common thing with tags? People don't either apply them or they're inconsistent when they do apply them.
Or both.
Or both, right? So put policy in place that says these are the tags that we expect for a value. And if they don't apply them, you can use like an append policy effect that says if they forget to put them on their resource, just put them in there for them so that they do exist. And then like I typically will put them in with a default value of like change me in capitals, quite clear, quite obvious. And then I'll have another policy that looks for all of my tags with a value of change me. I then have got a complete coverage. I know there's the lie of my land. I can go and, not be up, but I can go and have a chat with the people like, can you tag your resources properly, please? But, as I say a lot of them with my customers with logic apps and functions, and I know you chatted about functions last time, but it's a limit of your imagination and your skills at that point because everything's an API in Azure. So I've got logic apps that take CSV spreadsheets from like customers' finance systems, query the charge codes, the ones that are valid for Azure consumption, and then amend my Azure policy and say these are the only ones that you can put in as the values. You can go to some real extremes with it, but from a very basic level, just put in cost center, environment, production, all those sort of things. Just get a baseline there, but having that policy keep everything in check, that everything's going to be consistent going forward.
Definitely, it's something I see because do you know it's funny? Like I've worked in one-man bands, you know, with a contract, and I would set up the hosting. So, you know, like, I remember looking at, like, doing it, and I remember seeing tags for the first time. I was like, "What is this?" I said, "I don't need no tags." Um, and that's fine. See if it's you're one person and it's maybe 10 virtual machines or something like that, that's totally fine. But the minute you scale to more than probably 2 people, tags is absolutely essential because that's, you know, like you say, it's it's one of the things that I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but it's something that does come up, and it may come up in the exam, for instance, and like that with the tag side of things, it is something that you get, and it's really important because if you can put in like a department, the environment, that's fine. You know, like an environment is normally something that you normally have like a naming convention that says everything that's development starts with D dash or T dash for test, etc. That's not always possible though. So stuff like that, like tags, it's funny because I actually went through and implemented tagging for my team at Octopus, and one of the things was like, for instance, one of the things that we do at Octopus, we have loads of different instances of Octopus, right? So we deploy a lot of stuff to Azure, using ARM templates, you know, like so like that. But the thing is you go in and I'm like, I have no idea who deployed this. I don't know when it was deployed. You have to go through and you go through all your audit logs, and it's like, right. And it's hard. Whereas if you just, it's like 3 or 4 things, person and, you know, maybe an operator name, space ID for us, and a few other bits. But it just clarifies everything so much. It makes everything so much easier.
And
Um,
the way that I think policy complements tagging so nicely is how many different ways, depending on where you are in the world, can you spell cost center? Is it
or
RE or ER?
yeah, the Americans can get pretty kind of interesting with that. Um,
Exactly, but if you set that in policy, you've defined what your spelling is because that's what you need for billing, and that's what your finance team rely on. So, this is what you're keeping everybody on the straight and narrow. You're keeping everybody out of the bad books of finance. Cost
yeah,
center is spelled RE or ER, however you want to spell it, but you set it in
RE,
stone.
RE,
RE,
always
yeah,
RE.
RE. Although vCenter was always the one because used to love VMware vCenter. It was brilliant because you see like VMware vCenter where you logged in, but then somebody had actually named the appliance the other way around. I love that. That used to
Oh,
that was like my tick of the day.
nice, nice. It's been a while since I used anything. Actually, saying that though, I am working on vCenter just now, but it's workstation, rather than full fat VMware. But no, that's really cool. So, is there anything that you want to show people who are attending?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, if you want to share my screen, that I've got some slides here. So the standard stuff, but I think one real key concept to understand around um, Azure is the Azure Resource Manager. Now, you probably refer to ARM and you hear ARM templates. They are the same thing. So ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager, and it sits right at the center of Azure. So everything you do goes through Azure Resource Manager or ARM. So when you log into the portal and you want to, log onto a VM, that's an action that you need to have permissions for from RBAC, as we were discussing right at the beginning. So first of all, Azure Resource Manager will authorize you and say, what have you got access to and what permissions have you got to do on those resources that you've got access to? And that's tied right into the resource manager. Now, whether you're going to access or, however you're going to interact with that VM, say you're going to add a new disk, right? So yes, okay, you've got the permissions, Derek. You can add a new disk to this VM. So you can create the disk and you can attach it, right? But also, it doesn't matter how you're doing that, whether that's from the portal itself, whether you're going to do that from PowerShell, the Azure CLI, any of the SDKs that we publish, or whether you're just going to do that as a direct REST API call, something like Postman, for example, right? Everything goes through ARMS and you can't avoid it. And that's the best thing that I say to my customers is you don't have to worry about how your developers are accessing or interacting with it. So for your example, Derek, um, Octopus Deploy, that's going to have permissions to interact with Azure, probably via service principal or a managed identity.
That's the
But
one, yeah.
you don't need to worry about how it gets there. It's still going to hit ARM. So whatever you apply at ARM is the truth. And that's what is applied at that time. And then once you're authenticated, it'll pass it off to the various resource providers, which actually go and do those actions on the underlying, the underlying hardware that sits beneath Azure. So everything goes through ARM. One really nice thing about ARM is you don't have to worry about it, right? It's globally resilient. It's replicated across all our regions. You don't have to worry about accessing it. Front door sits in front of it. So there you go. If you want another use case to understand where front door sits, front door sits in front of ARM. If you look at the URLs, you'd be able to work that out. But yeah, so it's the central point for access and management of all your tools. Now, actually, I'm just going to scroll down and find another slide that I'm hoping I've got in here, which I have. We talked about policy quite a lot. And as you can see, this is the same diagram, just shown slightly differently. So we've got our, whether it will come from the portal, the CLI, third parties, and accessing it. And we've still got Azure Resource Manager here. But we've got policy that sits right alongside the Azure Resource Manager. So again, back on the same principles of permissions, you can't avoid policy because it goes through ARM. So if you can't avoid ARM via using a different tool because it has to come through Resource Manager, but that's where the API is authenticated and authorized, policy is exactly the same. Once you're authorized, it then checks policy and goes, can this happen? And it will get a yes or a no reply. And if it can, great. If it can't, you stop then your tracks there. And then it will get passed off to the various resource providers beneath that. So, they're so tightly coupled, and that's the key. There is no avoiding these. So, going back a little bit, we probably treated cloud approach a little bit like this in the past, where we're talking about, hold on, I need to approve everything you're doing in the cloud, and I don't trust you, and you need to make sure you're doing X, Y, and Z, and all these. You're deploying this size of VM, you're doing disk encryption, you've got backup enabled. But actually, let's flip it around. Let's give our devs a bit of trust, right? Let's give people who are using the platform trust, but make the platform look after itself. So set the platform with your policy, set the platform with the permissions you want, and you haven't got to worry about how they interact with it. They can use Terraform, PowerShell, ARM template, the portal, whatever they like. But you can sit there as an operations or a platform operations team, as we're hearing more and more, that they can just, sit there and know that they can't do anything that's outside of the guidelines that you've set.
Yeah, no, I really like that, because that's the thing. Like, it's funny. It's I've worked at places in the past, and you work in obviously, we all work in technology, right? And the thing that gets me though um with technology is we don't trust people to use the technology sometimes, and I think that's where it's key, because I'm a big fan of trust but verify. Like, treat other people as adults. Like,
Yeah.
treat them as knowledgeable people who know what they're doing, and they'll get on with their job better. But put a framework in place that they can need to work within, and I think that's where this comes in really nicely. Because that's the thing. Is like what I've it I come from. It's funny, obviously, I saying I can't come from operations, but I've been through several iterations of operations, and one of them used to be the developer was the bad guy, right? The developer would be the one um, who wouldn't actually. They would always be doing something, because you want uptime, they want features, and that's
Yeah.
it was always, and that's where obviously those silos kicked in, and this is where DevOps kicks in. You give
Absolutely.
people, frameworks, the policies. Obviously, I noticed Azure Blueprints, and I've been learning all about Azure Blueprints recently. So, like that as well, that all ties in nicely to that. And this is
Yeah,
the
and
thing that,
Blueprints is a really interesting one, and we'll definitely discuss that quickly. So Blueprints, a lot of people have, where do I use Blueprints? What's the overlap between Blueprints and policy? Because effectively, a blueprint is a collection of artifacts, right? So RBAC assignments, ARM templates to deploy things like VNets, resource groups, basically anything you can put in an ARM template, and also then your Azure policy assignments, and you assign a blueprint to a subscription, right?
yep,
Now, a lot of people go, well, if I'm doing DevOps and I've got people who write ARM templates natively, and I can write my ARM templates to do my RBAC assignments and my policy assignments and my policies, what do I need blueprints for? And you're like, well, this is it. And but this is my take, my personal opinion. I think blueprints for people that don't want to do infrastructure as code, but they want the benefit of scale and being able to apply something repeatably
right,
to multiple subscriptions. Whereas if you've got the infrastructure as code background, and you're comfortable with things like Git and Terraform or ARM templates, and you're happy living inside of VS Code, as a lot of the operations people are transitioning in towards, definitely. Certainly something I've been on for a long time, learning that world. But now I'm comfortable with it. I don't need blueprints, because I can apply everything consistently from a pipeline inside of Octopus or
yep,
GitHub or Azure DevOps, and everything's treated as code. I check it in, create a pull request, somebody approves it, it happens, right? And that's the dream. But if you're not in that world and you still want that scale and you want that repeatability across your subscriptions, blueprints are for you because you can drive it all from the portal. You can attach all your artifacts, assign your blueprint, and lock it to a subscription, and know it's going to be consistently applied to you.
Nice. No, I really like that. Do you know, I never thought about that. I never thought it. I think I'm just so kind of used to working as infrastructure as code, that I never even thought about that. I just thought it was a way for you to source control your entire stack, not just the infrastructure, but the policies, etc. And that sounds awesome.
Yeah, blueprints are an interesting one. It's something my customers ask me a lot about, and it's the key question is, how comfortable are you with infrastructure as code principles and DevOps? Because if the answer is yeah, we're happily do it that way, and we write ARM templates and everything's deployed via a pipeline, I would steer my customer away from a blueprint because they've got the skills to be able to do that natively without having to put another tool in the way. Whereas
Right.
if they're like, actually, we're pretty small, we're a small team, we don't really understand infrastructure as code, we're learning, but we just need a way of consistently applying across multiple subscriptions. Blueprints is a great tool for that, and it's a good way of ticking. We've got blueprints out of the box for like UK official. PCI compliant environments, those sort of things where people just go, I need an environment really quickly that's compliant with X, Y, or Z. There's probably a blueprint for it. Go and find it, deploy it, happy days, but then learn from it, right? Nothing's hidden. That's the thing I love about Azure. Nothing's hidden. So you can go and pick that blueprint to pieces and get the infrastructure as code out of it and export the template and go and tweak it yourself. And you can always learn by just deploying something manually, no matter how you're comfortable with PowerShell, Portal, whatever. You can always export the ARM template later because that is, the rawest format that Azure will accept.
Yeah, I won't lie. That's pretty much how I do most of my own templates. I'll create I'll create something in the portal, and then I won't quite deploy it. I'll take it, download the JSON, hack away at it, remove the stuff I don't want, add stuff in, and then at that point, then I deploy it. So yeah, no, that sounds perfect. No, that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing to be ashamed of with that as well, right? We're going a little bit off topic here, but don't be afraid to do that. Derek does it, I do it, especially when new features and services come out. Sometimes the documentation isn't up to date as you need it. You might see something on Twitter that's really hot off the press, and the docs haven't finished rolling out yet. So you might want to go, well, what do I need to do to configure that via my own template? And you're like, oh, I don't know. Go and configure it in a portal, hit the export template button. It'll throw it back at you because the underlying code will be there.
Yeah, it's
So
beautiful.
yeah,
I mean, to be
really.
honest, it works. It works at least 95% of the time anyway. But yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, it does make it super reusable, and that's it. I do want to jump into policies a bit more. I won't lie, because the thing
Yeah,
is
no,
that I really I like that the way you put it was guardrails. It's just in there to, it's there to effectively help you and guide you to get the infrastructure that you need for what you're doing with your job.
absolutely. So let's just dive quickly into the governance scope. So I've got a nice diagram here about what we talked about earlier. I just want to put a picture representation around what we spoke about. So we spoke about the different governance scopes within Azure. So right at the top, we've got that Azure AD tenant. Everything talks up to the Azure AD tenant. That's where it gets its identity source from, right? Your management groups live below that, subscriptions below that, and then resource groups and resources, and everything inherits down. So it's important to keep that in mind. And as for I think this is what we were talking about earlier, right? In terms of structures that you can map out. You might have prod and dev, you might have HR, IT, finance, whatever, right? There is no right or wrong ish on how you organize that. And we'll cover something called enterprise scale in a second, after we've dived into policy, because we've got some really nice reference implementation and architectures for designing your effectively your management group structure, your subscriptions, your policies, RBAC assignments about do this, don't do this. If you do this, this might happen. So setting you up to scale and grow in the future. So we'll definitely cover that in the future. Now, while I stop sharing my screen and log into my Azure portal, which I haven't done yet, which is a bad thing from me, give me 2 seconds. Let me just log into the Azure portal. So have you played any with any policies, Derek? Have you had time to sort of dive into them?
I got a couple of days. What happens is I write pitches for work. So like whenever we do something that's going to take, a specific, even if it's a few days, we normally just write it up. And one of the things that I did was jump in and do some policies. So mine's was region. That's what I was playing with, because what it is we're dotted all over the world. So I just kind of wanted to cut that down, because anybody could effectively deploy anywhere. So I did some bits in. There's certain US ones, like I actually bypassed the UK and went straight to West Europe. Do you know? Because it's funny, because West Europe is actually closer to me, but in a different country, whereas UK South is further away, but technically in the same country, depending on where you sit with Scottish independence. But that's a joke that we can talk about. That's something else we need to talk about. But yeah, it was mostly about location that I was jumping in and having a lot of that play about. But it's so powerful, and it does only take you doing something like that takes what 15 minutes.
Yeah.
In a day. See, be honest, obviously you need to, if you're working in a larger organization, you need to get buy-in. But like that, it does only take maybe a few days, and you can get sensible policies in place that will start you along that journey, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. It starts small, and then as you learn and evolve, expand and expand and expand, and keep tweaking your policies. And I think the most important thing about policy, as you tighten that screw, if we call it that, and get tighter with your guardrails, educate your users. The best thing I can say: educate your users as to why you're making this change and why it has an impact to the business. Because if I went out then today and I controlled an environment that you were a developer in, Derek, and I went today, you can't deploy any SQL databases. Flat out. That's it. No Azure SQL
Yeah.
database anymore. I'm pretty sure if you deploy an app, you're probably going to want a database of some kind, and SQL tends to be the default choice. So that would impact you quite a lot. And if I hadn't educated you or told you why I was making that change, there may be a compliance change or a security thing that's come through that says we can't deploy this for X, Y, Z reason anymore. No more. If I've just gone and put that in place, how many support tickets are going to get raised? How many?
So many.
Exactly, right.
And let's put it's not just the number of tickets, it's also the tone of the tickets. You would get some pretty rubbish tone.
Yeah, you're very true. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the key thing, because what I say is put policies in auditor mode first. So don't stop anything. Just be aware of how bad the problem might be.
Yeah.
So it will scan the environment. It will pick up what's going on. And instead of me talking about it, I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I appreciate it's pretty small. Let me dive into policy. So you can just type into the top blade, get into policy, and we will let it load. So what scope am I at? Where am I? This is where the demo gods are not going to play with us. It's always the risks of doing it live.
Oh, yeah. Have you not sacrificed your sacrificial lamb 3 times daily to the demo gods like they demand?
I haven't had the time, I've barely had time to make coffee today. So as you can see, it's got my management group structure here, so I can query any of these scopes, or I can filter down to individual subscriptions, and if that's the case. I'm actually just going to turn off a couple of subscriptions and just have one environment active, because this one's pretty messy. So let's just filter those out, and everything should update. So as you can see here, you get an overall compliance score, how many are non-compliant, how many are compliant, exempt. Now, this is something I teased you with earlier, Derek, but this is the new feature that's come out as part of Ignite. So as you can see, policy exemption, there's a link here, so ak.ms AZ policy exemption. So before, a policy was either applied or it wasn't. You excluded it from a scope, and the resources underneath that weren't checked. Well, now you might have, say, you've got applied a policy at a management group like allowed locations, and say you've chosen UK West, right, as your only allowed region. Now, obviously, that doesn't get all the features straight away. There is a bit of a delay getting features to UK West as based on demand. So things can take a time rolling out. But say you need to develop an application that's using one of the bleeding edge features, and it's only available in North Europe, right? Before, you'd have to go in and exclude that and make a change to the policy. And you still can do that, and it's still technically non-compliant with your policy. So you may go into the policy and go, actually, we're going to add North Europe into this scope and allow it. But you could use an exemption to basically put in it's exempt, and a justification reason why, and put a timeline on it. So instead of just saying it's exempt and somebody forgets about it, you can exempt them now and say it's exempt for 6 months, and this is why we excluded it at the time. So a bit of metadata around why you're excluding resources, instead of just going, oh yeah, exclude it, it'll work, don't worry about it. Because by that you're creating pinholes. It's like the old thing, right, of putting any rules in your firewall to get things working. You'll forget about them, they never get cleaned up, and then they're there, and then you do a review, and you're like, oh no, what's happened to the firewall? Whereas if you put a rule in place that was only there for a certain amount of time and removed itself, you'd force the problem to be fixed in the long run. So exemptions are a great new feature that are coming into that. As you can see, I haven't really gone through any of the setup in this, so I haven't played with exemptions yet, but it's on my list. So if I was to dive into the policies, we have policy definitions, which are effectively the rule policies in terms of the code that they are underneath. So as you can see, we've got one here that says permitted regions. That is a custom policy that I've built. So let's go and search for the region one instead. And it's called locations handily. I always remember that. So if I look at allowed locations, every policy is just a JSON object. So it's just an ARM template effectively. So we've got our parameters, we've got some metadata about the policy, and then we've got the rule. And this is the important part. So the policy rule itself. And, it's an if this, then do this. All it is. So we're saying if all of these fields equals the parameters that, the values we've set here. So we're saying if the location is in the parameter list of allowed locations, and that's just an array object. So we can put in all of our regions there, and we'll assign this in a second to see the effect. And it's not in the global because some resources are global by nature, like Azure Active Directory doesn't have a region, it's everywhere. And it's not a B2C directory in Azure Active Directory because of what we just spoke. So if it doesn't meet these criteria, then deny the creation of the resource. So we could put this policy in place. So if I click assign, and I go, let's choose the scope to assign this to, and let's choose a subscription. Which one shall we pick today? Let's go on my credit card because I'll definitely need to clean it up. And let's just put the test in here, and I can say next. Now it's asked me to fill out those parameters. So one of the parameters was the allowed locations, and I get a drop down of all of the regions that exist. So let's just say the only allowed region for me is the European regions. So I can say North Europe and West Europe.
So you can not only is it per actual like Azure region, but it's also geographical regions as well.
Yeah, that's new. I haven't seen that before, if I'm perfectly honest with you. So if I put in United States, okay, that's cool. So I tick that. I'll tick United Kingdom as well, and we'll see what happens, right? We'll learn as we go. I don't need a managed identity for this because this policy is not doing any remediation, but that's another great thing for policy. So there's an effect called deploy if not exists, which effectively means if the resource you're querying for in the all of looking part of the policy, so you say if I don't know, one that I'm working on at the moment is right. If a budget doesn't exist on a subscription, then go and create a budget following this ARM template that you've put in the policy. So you can make the platform auto heal itself. Think of the possibilities like you spin up a new subscription, put it in a management group that inherits a policy that creates a VNet. So if a VNet doesn't exist, create a VNet and peer it to the hub. You could, as I say, it's the limit of your imagination and skills at that point, but the platform will support you. So we don't need a managed identity because it doesn't need any permissions to do anything to the scope that we're applying this. Are we all good? Yeah, go and create that. One thing here, and this is really key to pay attention to, it can take 30 minutes for a policy to take effect. So it's got to propagate through ARM, go through all the scopes and make sure it's fully applied. So we'll leave that a few minutes. Generally within sort of 2 or 3 minutes that would have taken effect. But if we go back to policy, and I now go back to assignments because we've assigned that policy or assigned that definition, we should be able to find it. If I put test on the name, I'm pretty sure. It's going to be played nicely. Always the fun bit. As you can see, I've not done this once or twice. Where's it gone? Let's refresh that. Okay, let's give it a chance to see if it comes through. It can take some time. Unless you can see it, you can see locations. I can't,
unfortunately.
Let's just do the good old, let's just refresh the whole thing. Now the scope's going to play up. I know where I assigned it there, so let's go and fill that stuff out. Okay, let's give it a chance and see if it pops through. But yeah, once it's assigned, you should see it in the list of assignments. And then when you go back to the overview blade, you'll get how compliant that is. Now, it can take time for things to scan. So by default, policy scans at least once every 24 hours. But it also, every time you create a resource or update a resource, and obviously it's going through that arm as I showed in this diagram earlier when I find it. As it goes back through this, going through the policy engine, going through resource manager, every time you create a resource or read or update it, so CRUD, it will go through policy and validate it. So say you've got an existing resource deployed today, you suddenly then tweak the policy, like another tag needs to be added, and somebody goes to change a specific property, like, I don't know, scales up your SQL database, because that tag, it was compliant, but now it's not because you've added another tag to your policy, it'll actually fail that check because actually you need to add something else to it and you're doing a CRUD request. But if you added a new tag and the resource stayed the same and you weren't doing anything to it, after 24 hours, you'd see it appear as non-compliant in the policy portal, because obviously it had fallen out of compliance with your policy, your declarative state of this is what it should look like.
Yeah. Nice.
Let's go back into policy. Let's go back into assignments. All right, we're just going to do it again because, I think I might have done something silly. It's not an initiative. Of course it isn't. Hold up. So let's go allowed locations. And it's just a different way of doing the same thing, right? It's just a different way into the same location. So let's type in United Kingdom in there again, and let's tick the European regions.
It's sad that we're no longer part of Europe.
It certainly is. I can agree on that. There we go. So I don't actually have permissions over this scope. Interesting. This is the problem of having too many things and too many access. Right, let's go and put it in this one instead then. Because I definitely do have access here. That one. Great fun today with my portal.
You definitely haven't done your sacrifice for the demo gods.
There you go. So I've got one in here that's taken effect anyway, right? We'll just use the one that I've got in here already. So I've got a policy initiative assigned here. So an initiative is a group of policy definitions. So instead of you having to assign different policies all the time, you could group all of your policy definitions together in an initiative and then assign that initiative instead. So think of it as like a group of policies. So it's a much easier way of scaling. So I've got one here for allowed locations and resource groups because they're actually two different scopes to look at. Resource groups sit above resources. So it's a good thing to pair those together and assign them, because what you can end up with is your resources can't be created in the regions that you've not allowed, but your resource groups can be created anywhere. And I see that quite often. Somebody will go and do the first thing, create a resource group and go, well, I can still create stuff, so I should be able to do that. And actually, it's because the policy is not looking for that. So you need to be very careful there. And as you can see, I've got 100% resource compliance in this subscription. And if I look at the assignment, it will be, I'm pretty sure it's a deny effect. So we're saying on this scope, so inside my MVP subscription, excluding a specific resource group because I've built a bot and I had to build it somewhere else. The permitted regions are, and I've probably got a few things searched in here, so East US and East US 2, North Europe, UK South and UK West, and West Europe and the West US region. So say I go and try and create something in, let's go, you're talking about Australia, let's go Australia East. So we'll pick that as a region to go and create something in and see what happens, and we'll go from there. So on this scope, let's go and try and create something. So let's do create a resource. Let's do a resource group. And let's pick, let's just call this DevOps Eric RSG. And let's pick one of the Australia regions. Australia East. So by rights, I shouldn't be able to create this. And there you go. I can't.
Woo!
So, nice. And it will tell you here because it's blocked by policy and it says disallow by policy here. Now, you'll notice that it will be varied, the message you get back. So if you were to do this on a VM, it would probably tell you the policy. We're working on making this experience better because it's quite hard to work out which policy has blocked you. Because, now you think from a user perspective, you go and try and create a ticket going, oh, I can't do this, or you're trying to understand. there could be thousands of policies assigned. So being able to say this policy has blocked me is going to help the support guys a lot more.
Yeah.
If I went into the raw error, as you can see, that's not exactly easy to read. But I can work out in here that it was the permitted regions policy that's assigned at this scope. You get the idea, but that's not pretty. So we're working on making this experience better for our users. So on the VMs, the VM throws back actually the policy that's denying that resource creation.
Nice. I'd imagine it would be quite difficult. Sometimes the way I'm kind of seeing this is it's almost kind of similar to group policy, like in a way. Like you gather them, like like you've got several group policy objects. That's almost like an initiative. And then obviously from that, it's like I always hated troubleshooting group policy objects because there's just so many of them in layers upon layers, and you're never quite sure which one is actually the one that the culprit.
Doing GP results, dash R's and RSOPs and all those sort of things, trying to work out what's going on. Yeah, no, that they are good days, and working out if somebody's put like group policy merge mode into like replace or merge and all of those good things. Yeah, good days. Glad I don't have them anymore.
Honestly, I could go back to that. I had hair back then. I make that same joke every week. But yeah, I definitely had hair.
I think one of the key things to take away from policy is it's super flexible. So you can create. There is a VS Code extension. Let me just load up VS Code really quickly. For policy.
Power Toys. I just saw Power Toys. I love it.
Oh, you got to have Power Toys around, right? So let's just go into here, for example. You need the Azure account extension installed. So I'll just show that here when it loads. So you need the Azure account extension installed, which lets you log into your Azure environment, and then you'll see there's an Azure policy extension. And it says preview, but feel free to use it. It works. I can vouch for that. Once my extension's finished loading, you'll see I've got the policy icon here, and it's logged in to my Microsoft account. So if I click on the policy extension here, you can browse your tree. So this is my internal subscription. And I've got some bits and pieces in here. So say I wanted to look at, I don't know, storage accounts, for example. I can go into resource providers. And this is querying live now, right? So it's making API calls, doing the calls to ARM and going, tell me what Jack's got permissions to and tell me what he can see so that I can start digging into these a bit more.
I'm adding this in just as you're talking through this.
It's awesome, right? It's pretty heavy extension. I'll be honest. So it does a lot of queries, and as you can see, it's going through in the bottom right hand corner. It's going through all the different resource providers to tell me what exists. So we'll give that a few seconds. There's actually, and they announced this at Ignite as well. There's a preview version of this that does some evaluation stuff as well, which looks like it's made its way into the main release, which is great. So before you had to make a policy, apply it, and then wait and see if it worked or not. Or try it. Now we're bringing that capability down to the VS Code extension where you could author a policy locally on your machine and then go, if I was to assign this policy, what would it do before I actually go and do that? And it would say, you put the resources that you'd want to check against, and then you choose the policy you want to assign it against and click evaluate, and it will run it through like a local version of the policy engine on your machine. Really, really cool. Nice. So if I dig into compute and I go into virtual machines, and here you go, I've got a DC in here. So if I click on that and get rid of some PowerShell I was writing the other day, if I now close that. So this is the ARM export. So you're probably thinking this is really similar, but this is the ARM or the definition of my VM inside my subscription. So we were talking about this earlier, right, Derek? So allowed OS versions and stuff like that. So we could make a policy. How would we? We only want to allow 2019 data center edition, right? Now, everything in policy uses those things here. So we call this these strings aliases within Azure. So Microsoft.compute tells you the resource provider, and then anything after that is a namespace. So it could be a resource, or some of them, like storage accounts, have sub resources. So like a storage account container is a sub resource of a storage account. So this could go on many multiple / and many sub resources. But finding these, so the left-hand side, the keys or the values of what we need to put in our policy is sometimes the tricky piece. So if I was to hover over SKU here, there you go. there is the policy alias that I need for my policy. So I can literally hit copy. And now when I go and create a new policy, I've instantly got all of the references that I'm going to need to put in that policy to go and check for.
That is nice. I
So
like that.
it makes it really easy to start authoring policies. And again, this is against live things you've deployed. So as we said earlier, right, go and deploy it however you like. Doesn't really matter. But you can still use the tools to come back and help you extract this process, which may be deemed as pretty hard because it's code, it's JSON. But you can hover over any of these things. So I could make sure that the admin username is set to something that I want instead of something random. Really easy things. This might be, there you go, patch mode. So this is the new patching, automatic patching. That's another thing to talk about.
Nice.
But even that has got code coverage in policy right now. And if you find one that hasn't got coverage, so you might hover over one of these and it might say none. There you go, no aliases for this item. There's a GitHub repo for Azure policy, which I've got handily loaded somewhere else. So this repo here. Exactly. Here's one I did earlier. Go and create an issue. Go and create. There's no alias for this resource. And the product team will review this and they will come back and say, yes, it's on a roadmap, or no, it's not coming, or, here's the reasons why, basically. But this is your best way of getting that sort of interaction. So if you can't find one or for the alias, put it in here. Great place to put it. Also, all of the built-in policies and everything you find in the portal are built in here, so you can find them. So if I went to policy definitions, I can find all of the policies that we spoke about earlier. So if I go into general, I'll probably find the allowed locations one earlier. So if you just want to steal what we've got, it's all here. So we hide nothing. It's all open source. It's all there. You can submit pull requests against it if you really want to. If you want to make a change to it, or you find something's not working quite right, or you've got a new policy that you think everybody should have, come and contribute it. And with that, community effort, like you're doing tonight, and we're chatting, there's also a community policy repo. So these are a bit more like everybody can submit a bit more to. They still have to be approved and pulled into the repo, but there's some more custom ones in here for sort of more niche scenarios that customers have had. So compute, there's a great one in here. You probably learned about this in your exams, Derek, around hybrid usage benefit.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure there is one in here.
It's just below.
Was it there?
It was just below that at the general.
There it is. Yeah. So there is a policy. There's policies in here to say when you deploy a Windows server, make sure that the AHub box is ticked. So that's cost companies quite a lot of money. So we're saying here, if the type is a virtual machine and the image of it equals Windows Server, automatically deploy if not exists, go and tick the license type to make sure it's Windows. If it doesn't, the license type doesn't equals Windows Server, which basically means AHub enabled, then go and submit this ARM template and change that field to be Windows Server. And that's where you can get the platform to auto heal itself. So because this is a deploy if not exist policy, you could assign this. Doesn't matter how the people create the VM. So if they create it, forget to tick the box, this policy will come in and tick the box for them afterwards.
That's lovely. It's almost like DSC for policies, isn't it?
It's a really good way of putting it. It's DSC for your for the Azure platform.
Yeah, nice.
DSC goes inside, and that's probably the final thing we'll say on policy. Policy can now also go inside the guest operating system and has been in preview for a little while. So they call it in-guest policies. And I was lucky enough to be at Ignite last year. And I remember the guy getting up on stage and went, group policy is 25 years old. Group policy is dead. Azure policy is here. And I was like, okay, bold statement. I like where you're going with it. It's going to take some time. But you can actually, there is on the docs, there's a way to convert your group policy. So if you export your group policy, you can convert it to an Azure policy. So then if you think, stop treating your servers as cattle, stop treating your servers as pets and join them to domains, you can, VMs might not need to be domain joined anymore, but you still want to check for things within them that are set correctly. Azure policy doesn't care whether it's domain joined or not. Also with Azure Arc also uses Azure policy. So you can check for things no matter where they are in any cloud, anywhere. So on-prem, AWS, GCP. But say you want to check who's in the default admins group or the local admins group, you can set an Azure in-guest policy for that, roll it out via Arc, and get one view across all your estate from Azure policy, no matter where that is. Really powerful.
That's really nice.
And finally, I appreciate we're getting towards the end of time, Derek, but one thing that I want to bring people's attention to is we spoke about a lot of Azure governance tonight, lots of different areas. We spoke about management groups, we spoke about subscriptions, we've spoken about tagging, we've spoken about policy, we've spoken about RBAC, we've spoken about PIM. We've spoken about a lot of things, and you're probably thinking, where do I even start? Cloud Adoption Framework is where you start, right? So if you go to this link here, or if you go to aka.ms/, enterprise scale /overview. And I'm sure we can put a link for that somewhere. And, if you go on my Twitter, you'll probably see it bashed a few times.
I can put that on.
Perfect. This is our recommended implementation for all of that Azure governance. So think of enterprise scale as the plumbing around your city, right? So when anybody builds a new city, the first thing you put in are the roads, plumbing, gas, electricity, right? Without those, nothing's going to work anyway. Think of that as your landing zone and your setup for enterprise scale, right? So in Azure, you need management groups, you need your subscriptions, you need your policy, you need your permissions all set up before you even put a workload in there, really, to be successful. So it's exactly the same. Now, if we look at the architecture for enterprise scale, you'll see that if I scroll down to this diagram, there's a lot to it. There's quite a few things to consider and design. But this is all governance-based stuff within Azure, and really important. So we spoke about management groups, we spoke about the subscriptions. You'll probably see an Azure policy icon somewhere if I scroll around. Yeah, so policy assignments, role entitlements. We've got DCs in here with role entitlements. We've spoken about privileged identity management, MFA, all of these things. Now, Microsoft of the past, you may have thought that actually it's pretty hard to get prescriptive guidance out of us in terms of this is what you should do. Well, actually, we've now split this up into 8 critical design areas, all the way from the EA all the way down to your sort of sandbox subscriptions. There is a section on each of these topics, so management groups and subscription organization. This is how you should design it. These are the considerations. These are the recommendations we say about doing it. This is how you should organize your subscriptions. There is prescriptive bullet points, point by point, as to what you can do with this. And this has been developed by a customer architecture and engineering team. It's fantastic. It's honestly one of the best things that I've seen come out of us in a while from a governance perspective. It's great. And it covers things all the way from, we talked about identity and access management. So whether that needs to be PIM, how to use RBAC, use PIM. Here's some custom role examples that we suggest you create. All of these bits and pieces, really, really nice. And if you go into implementation guidelines, there's loads of policies here that we say you could choose to apply. So if we go down to this security level, here's some basic policies that we suggest you enable. So we've got things in here like the locations that we've been talking about, resources that we allow and permit, making sure Azure Security Center is enabled by default instead of it being forgotten about, blocking subnets that don't have NSGs, because we all know that leaves them open and exposed to the Wild West. So, really, really basic things that just give you a start for 10 and keep people on the straight and narrow. And this has got implementation methods via GitHub. So you can go to this link here, all the underlying codes here. And we've got some reference implementations in here as well. So we would say that Contoso reference implementation is this. It basically uses Azure Virtual WAN as the shared connectivity hub. We've then got another model for AdventureWorks, which uses a typical hub and spoke model instead of vWAN. And then we've got a Wingtip Toys, which is, no hybrid connectivity at all, purely an online-based world. But as you'll see at the top of these, you've got a deploy to Azure button. You can literally hit that button, and it will take you to a portal experience where you can basically fill out these bits and pieces. So choose your region, and I won't deploy this because it will take some time. Fill in the prefix, so I'm going to call this JT Enterprise Scale. Yeah, I want some, all of the best practices that we talk about in that documentation. Yes, no buttons. Tell me what your subscription is. What one do you want to enable? Click deploy, and it will go and configure all that straight away. So out of the box, if you're worried about, I don't know which policies to assign, I'm not sure how to start, Enterprise Scale will give you a great sort of leg up to get that design from the start, and then you can tweak from there.
That's awesome. I won't lie, I've not saw this before, Jack. This is fantastic. I won't lie,
really nice
I wish I'd saw this a few months ago. But no, this is awesome, because that's the thing, is like that's what most of the defaults or where people want to get. So you can literally, and I have to say, I love the quick start templates. You've got so many of them for ARM templates, and it just cuts down everything. It saves you having to write, 300 lines of JSON. So this looks fantastic. No, I like
Yeah,
this.
and go on.
And you go.
So yeah, shameless self plug. So I do run a user group with my close friend and colleague Ryan down in Brighton. So the Sussex Azure user group, who I know a couple of your colleagues, Derek, have attended in the past.
Yep, they have.
We've obviously haven't met up in a while because of some COVID thing going around that we've all been at home for. We've started a podcast, and last week we had Christian Neese, who was, if you've ever heard of Azure Lighthouse, he was one of the principal program managers for designing that. But he's now part of the team that's been designing this and has written a lot of the ARM templates underneath it. And we were lucky enough to have him join us last week and talk about enterprise scale in detail, and why it's there and how it should be used. And what it really enables customers to do. So if you've got sort of 45, 50 minutes to spare, look for the Sussex Azure User Group podcast on any of your preferable podcast listeners, Apple, Spotify, Anchor, whatever you choose. You'll probably find it there. Episode 11 is all about enterprise scale. Definitely worth a listen.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we've actually overran by some magnitude by 25 minutes. We were supposed to finish up at 1:45, but honestly, I think, Jack, it's all great information. Really impressed. And honestly, obviously, I am now Azure Solution Architect, certified cloud architect. And I won't lie, I wish I had saw this before the exam. I'd have probably had more here, but honestly, Jack, a shout as well on Twitter. What's your how do people get in touch with you on Twitter?
Yeah, so it's Jack_ref, so REF. So I used to be a football referee, still am qualified, and that's where the hashtag came from.
You just went down a little bit in my estimations.
Oh no, come on, don't be like that.
No, I'm just. There's definitely songs there for you, Jack, but I don't think they're safe for YouTube. But seriously, honestly, thank you so much for coming along tonight. I learned a bunch. What I'll do as well is the video does take some time processing. I'll include the links that Jack has included in the YouTube description. But honestly, Jack, I might get you back on virtual networks and we can talk about all that as well. But awesome. Well, thank you very much. And everybody else, thanks for attending and have a great day.